Thank you, Michael. And thank you all for being here this afternoon. It is really a pleasure for us to be here. It has been a great pleasure to be showing our work here, and it's really nice to come here at the conclusion of the exhibition to speak in it and hopefully speak to some of you after the talk and answer any questions you might have about it. Michael, in his introduction, alluded to many of the things that we're going to discuss in our talk. We're going to talk to you a little bit about what our process has been, what our relationship's been like over the past 5 years, how we got to the point we are today in making the work, and maybe get into a little bit of our thinking about what the work is, what we hope it to be, and maybe what it will become in the near future. So this may be a little strange. I don't know how many times you have two people speaking to the audience at the same time and sharing one microphone, but we're going to take turns and go back and forth and just see how it goes, okay? So that said, if we forget to speak into the microphone and you can't hear one of us, just give us a little signal and we'll try to be more conscious of that. Because right now I can't hear the microphone at all, so it sounds like I'm just speaking. And so I do this, and it probably sounds very different to you, but I'll try to do this. No difference? Is this thing on? Okay. So to get things started, we're going to each take a turn to speak a little bit about some work that we made on our own prior to our collaboration, and maybe it will give you a little insight as to where this work came from. So this image here is from a series that I made called Setting in Place, which was part of my graduate thesis work, and it was a series where I wanted to spend some time reflecting on homes that I'd spent a lot of time in as a child, my parents' home, family, friends, relatives, homes of that nature that I had kind of an intimate relationship with, but had spent a fair amount of time away from, and so re-examining those. And in that process of making these images, I wanted to use photography as this way to act as a medium, or as a way to step back from the space and have some kind of buffer between me and the home. So the camera worked really well for that, and in the process, the goal was to, in some ways, document the space, but also acknowledge the shortcomings of that process and ultimately create a type of mythology about these homes, right? And so through creating this myth, I'd hope to find maybe a deeper truth or deeper relevance to what the spaces were. And so in the process of doing that, came along ideas related to like topo analysis, where you're doing this detailed study of the space that actually correlates or corresponds to a psychoanalysis of our interior space, right? How our interior space manifests into our exterior space, our living space. And then also ideas related to the uncanny, so where the thing that is familiar is unfamiliar and vice versa. So, stepping back into a space that you're familiar with, but then realizing that, in fact, there are things that are a little off. And also viewing a photograph of something that you think you're familiar with and realizing how that triggers different aspects of your perception. So this was, anyway, a little background on the work that I was making prior to my collaborative relationship with Dominic. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Dom.
Okay. So like Mark, I was working on my MFA thesis project at the same time. And I was approaching domestic interiors as well, but for completely different reasons. I was interested in ideas of memory, ideas and memories haunting us, and ideas of those memories being embedded in the home that we live in. No matter where we live, those things follow us. And that drew from my own personal experience of living in 15 different houses growing up, and wondering about the inhabitants of the home that lived there prior to my family and me, and how those things influence the way that you perceive the space as maybe threatening or maybe safe, or how those things can turn around on one another. So I was interested in creating or recreating these memories I had of living in my parents' different houses growing up. So this project spanned different houses. I went back to my parents' house and would photograph there. I photographed in the house my wife and I lived in. And throughout the span of the project, I think I photographed in 4 different homes. But they were all homes that I inhabited at some point. So then I would go in and I would take all the furniture out of a specific room, and then I would stage something that didn't exist. But that existed momentarily in something that I have experienced recently. Not recently, but in the past. But then recently, then going into the home, I would recreate that. So in a way, it talks about the constructed image versus memory. Where does that authenticity and truth lie in the photograph? And then how does the photograph become a document or a text that can be read about a truth claim about the space, talking about experience. So a lot of my images are going in and recreating something which are different than Mark's intentions as an artist working with photography. But what we noticed about our work when we started looking at it, during the graduate process of reviewing the work, we were working in isolated realms. And we weren't sharing our work with one another. We weren't in classes making work. We were just making work independently. But every once in a while, we would show each other an image, and the other would be like, I just made that image. And you're doing this thing that's supposed to be unique. And then it's kind of disheartening to see that someone else had a similar idea as you, which gets into the idea of how do 2 images that are different work together when they're placed by one another. I'm going to turn it back over to Mark for that.
Yeah, and I should add, so ultimately in graduate school, Dominic and I ended up sharing a gallery space for our thesis exhibition. It was a really large space, but all of our works then were in the same room together. And you know, as Dom said, there were some striking similarities between them. And ultimately, while at first it was discouraging, disheartening, it became really wonderful to see how the work actually elevated each other or worked in relationship to each other. So it was a really good experience, and it got us to really think about, you know, what does it mean to display images side by side and in the same proximity, and what is the experience to go through and have one image in your mind and then you experience another image, and how do they influence each other? So fast forward maybe a little bit into our lives post-graduate school and teaching and thinking about imagery and how we work with students and how we explain images and how we get to people to engage with images in a critical manner. We started thinking about this way. Like you have 2 images that are seemingly exist in separate places, separate time periods, different desires from the creators, but then you can't help but in your mind to form these relationships, right? So take these 2 images. You got Alexander Gardner's image from Civil War and Wynne Bullock's image of this child in a forest. And I'm not sure what you're experiencing right now, but for me, there's these automatic connections between the body, right, and the form and the landscape. And then it gets into, as I process that and think about it, the implications. So I'm looking at dead soldiers in a field, and I'm looking at a child laying down. Is this child dead? What happened here? How did these things come about? And then I'm also maybe appreciating the aesthetic beauty of Wynne Bullock's photograph and looking back at Alexander Gardner's photograph and thinking about it more in terms of landscape than document. And so there's this interesting back and forth that I think you can't help but engage with regardless of your feelings about the images, right? So you're forced into this relationship where you're comparing it back and forth and actually maybe investigating it and investing in the image more than you would so if the image was on its own. And so, you know, we both, I think, got a deeper understanding of that in our teaching, and then that came back to inform our understanding of our own work and spark this idea of us collaborating. Do you want to talk about this?
Sure. So then to back up a little bit, Mark mentioned we shared a gallery space for our MFA show. We divided that space right down the middle, so my images were on this wall and Mark's were on that wall, and they mirrored each other nicely so that you could go in and you can start building those connections because of that conversation, that dialogue that was happening between the two. So then as we started looking at that, that's when we got into the idea of maybe we should collaborate on making images. So we started talking about the similarities and the differences in our images, the repetition of shape, the use of light, color, and how that influences the way the images can be similar or read as similar, but then how things can create a narrative between the two images. So the light in my image here can be read as the light coming out of here. And individually, when you just look at my image, that can be read differently than Mark's image, but it forces the viewer to create a narrative that wouldn't be there if you looked at them individually. So we really enjoyed that was happening in our work. So then when we started showing this work together alongside of our collaborative work, we would hang our individual images really close, like we would here, to force a relationship to happen.
And you know, these images, in this respect, were never created with the intention of showing them with other images, right? They were supposed to contain their own strength and their own concept. But as we went back and looked at the work that we had made and thought about them and thought what we were doing in our collaborative work, we started to exhibit this work together, and it actually became a really refreshing approach for us to look back at old work and see how it could have a new life. And so we would just go through our images and pair these up. And you know, it seemed like they both kind of stepped away from their original conception and into this new thing, which was really great for us. I don't know what the reception was, but we felt really good about what was happening with the old work. That it seemed, you know, it's like you make work and you kind of move past and move on to new things. And sometimes it's hard to look back at your old work with the same appreciation as when you first created it. And so this was something that we've really enjoyed in the past few years. So moving into the work that we have in the gallery here. The first series that we did was titled Antilocal. And this came out of a really open place. We had no preconceived ideas about what this collaboration would be, about what the outcome should be, about conceptually how we wanted to work within this. And all we did to start out was make some basic formal parameters. And we kind of made some loose rules of what we would follow, right? We decided we're going to photograph in the home, and we decided on a format. We said, let's make them squares for no other reason than it would be a new challenge for us. And they would be color, and maybe they would be small. And from there, that was it. And so the assignment was given, and I made this picture in my home, and I didn't tell him anything about it. I just emailed it to him, and it showed up in his inbox. And I said, Merry Christmas, do something with this. And so Dominic made this image in response to it, and then we put them on the same canvas, and then we had to figure out, okay, we made something. What are we doing? What's going on here? How do we move forward? Is this going to work? Is this something we want to invest in? Is it something that's interesting to us? Does it make sense with what our conceptual ambitions are? And you know, I think just aesthetically and formally, we were excited by it. We felt that there was something happening here, but we needed a lot more dialogue. We needed a lot more work to figure out, you know, actually what's happening, right? So, and this is probably, you know, coming out of graduate school when it's, you know, it's a very heady time, and you're like, kind of theory and concept, everything's like rammed down your throat, and so you come out. And this was very freeing for us. We were just working, and this is a dangerous word, we were working intuitively at this point, which really was not the way we were accustomed to working.
Well, I think we were working intuitively to an extent, but with those parameters that we set for ourselves, we're working in the home. We knew why we wanted to work in the home. We were doing that beforehand with our own solo work. And we were working relatively big for photography, printing 24 by 30 and 20 by 30. And we wanted to work smaller, more intimate. And we knew that we wanted to play with the comparison of these two spaces, these two photographers making similar things. And we were both interested in ideas of the uncanny. So I think that was our starting point conceptually, is how can we play with ideas of the uncanny in this. But like Mark was saying, it was more intuitive and it was frightening to work that way when we were trained and been working for the past how many years? 3 years in graduate school with a plan and with a research agenda and with a concept and heavily theoretical ideas about our work. Those were there, they were just in the back of our mind. And we really, I think for me, I saw it as a natural and logical progression from where we were when our two respective thesis shows ended in the studio with that mirroring of one another.
So as we get into the work and we're making this series, one thing becomes very obvious to us that is important to the work, and that is geography and distance and communication. So over the span of this project, we lived in a number of different places. It started, I lived in Queens, New York. Dominic was in Youngstown, Ohio. And so we were like 1,100 miles apart, and we were sending these images back and forth. During the course of the project, Dominic moved from Ohio to Mississippi, and so we had the New York to Mississippi digital commute, and then I moved to Carrollton, Georgia, a year later, and then we were getting closer, and then I moved to Atlanta, a little bit further away. I was feeling a little too close to Dom. It wasn't working conceptually for the project, so I needed another 40 miles to make it work. But what's interesting is, so there's the geographic distance, and it's kind of becomes a psychological distance, right? Because even though, like, we're just looking at our computer screens, but mentally you're saying, oh, but he's very far away, so this is a big deal. Whereas it wouldn't really matter if he was in the next apartment over, in terms of that. But it seemed like there was interesting things that came up because of the geography, and also it got interesting when we'd move homes. So to think about what it means to live in one part of the country versus another part of the country, and how that influences, or how we perceive that influences our homes. Right? Dominic was living in a farmhouse in somewhat rural Ohio. I was in a very dense urban area living in a one-bedroom home. He has 43 acres of land. I have 400 square feet, right? But yet, we photograph our homes and things become painfully similar, right? Like, how is it that we own the exact same things? They're in the exact same place in our homes. When you reduce the image to something this close and intimate, it all becomes very similar.
Right. So we were noticing the similarities of the same generic backsplash, same blue bowls, same generic color wall paint on rental homes, and it kind of started us into the conversation of exploring this lack of a regional identity for this mass-produced national identity, and that became kind of troublesome. Because Mark, I always thought, oh, he's living in New York, he has all of this culture around him, but he goes home to the same generic stuff that I do. So I think, if I can back up.
Sure.
Back up. To this one with the silverware, it's still mass-produced objects, but I think this starts to talk a little bit more about our own personal identities, the patterns that are picked out, probably not by us, but our wives. And then it starts talking about the people that we're living with, and it's not just us anymore, but it starts to become the inhabitants of the home. And even something like this, I think, changes the perception of the way that we thought about the spaces we were living in. Mark made this image in New York, and I made this one in Ohio. And after I moved to Mississippi, I attended a CAA conference. It was in New York at the time. Mark was living in New York, so I called him and I asked him if I can stay with him. He was nice enough to say yes, so I didn't have to pay for a hotel. So then I visited his home, and I'm looking around like, I'm familiar with this place because I know it through photographs. And I always perceived this mirror to be a full-length mirror that was the same dimensions as this one. But then when I got to his home and I'm looking around, it's maybe like this big, and then mine's like full body length. And that changed the way that I thought about what I knew about his home and how photography, and I know this because I'm a fan of photography, but it's still something you forget, that what's represented in the photograph isn't necessarily true or perceived as reality or the way that you would perceive it when you see it. So that was something that came out of the project that I was really interested in. Again, going back to my thesis project about the constructed image and how we're making these truth claims about things and the way that memory works made me think about the different homes I was living in again throughout my childhood and how those can be perceived differently by different people.
Yeah, and so as this series continues, there's always the decision about how much personal information you're going to put within an image and how much it's going to be revealed. And we both were married, and so do we include our wives' lives in this? And what does this say about the person that lives there? Like for me, it's fine. I have a dirty bathtub drain, but maybe for my wife, that's not something she wants, exhibited or online or displayed in a way like this. So, it's interesting how self-editing comes into this when you're dealing with your own personal. It's much easier when you're going into somebody else's home or making photographs of someone else, but when it becomes about you and your, it's interesting. So, I'll let you do that.
Okay, so the way that our process worked, Mark mentioned this before. One of us will make a photograph. We won't talk about what we're photographing or why we're photographing it. Then we just email it to the other person. And then the other person responds. And then we send the match back on the same canvas. And then the other one reviews it. And then there's that difficulty of two people working together. And you have to make an image that pleases yourself, that corresponds with the other one to create this dialogue, and then that pleases the other person. So Mark made this image of his medicine cabinet, and I look at it and I'm like, what am I going to do? I don't really care about the stuff in my medicine cabinet. I'm not inspired to photograph it. So I made this image and I sent it back to Mark, and he replied that, it's not working. It's not very, very good. I forget exactly what his words were, but he was right. It wasn't good. Right? So he made me reshoot, which is probably for the better. And that happens a lot. Like one of us will shoot something, send it to the other, and then the other one will look at the original image and go back and reshoot to match the match. So it challenges us to become better at photography, to be more thoughtful in what we're including and excluding in the imagery, and to try to create a dialogue. For instance, with this image, this is not the original one I sent to Mark, but I sent Mark one that had 3 holes in it, and Mark responded with this image. And I was like, wow, I like Mark's so much better than mine. So I went back and I reshot for a better match. And it kind of went back and forth like that for a while. Or one of us would make an image, and then we would hold on to it for about 2 years. And then one day we would see something in our home, and then we'd make a match and send it back to the other person and be like, wow, I totally forgot about that. And it's a nice surprise, because it did feel like your birthday when you would open up your inbox and you would see maybe 1 or 2 or 3 files from the other person, and then you had this challenge and this job to do and responsibility to another person. So we became accountable for making art. I think it's really easy right out of graduate school to stop making work, or right out of a BFA program to stop making work, feel like you need that break. But now the work that we were making, each other depended on it equally.
Yeah, and just to speak a little more about collaboration, at a certain point it really becomes an exercise in diplomacy. and figuring out how you're going to communicate with somebody when, in some ways, you know, this work has forced our relationship to become very close. We became extremely good friends. We talked on a daily basis. You know, it gave us a reason to talk to each other. We were either messaging back and forth or talking on the phone or sending email, and these communications build up and build up. And, you know, because we're working in our homes, you know, more intimate details or personal details are arising in the work. And then somebody's, you know, not somebody, he sends me an image that's maybe no good, right? And like, how do you, like, just turn around and be like, no, it's not good. And both of us, I think we're fairly reserved individuals. So there's a lot of like kind of like passive aggressiveness or just like total silence. And that was often the worst thing.
Oh yeah, because you'd be really excited about an image. You'd be like, this is the best image I ever made in my life. And I would send it to Mark, and I would be expecting something like the next week. And then that would turn to months and maybe a couple of years. And then you forget about that image and it's not a big deal.
Yeah, or maybe, and maybe it's like all about interpretation too, you know, so you get one and then you forget about it, and so you don't respond to it, but on his end he has no idea that I just forgot about it. He thinks I'm intentionally not saying anything about it, and so, you know, it gets complicated. You know, collaboration is this powerful thing that engages you, but it also complicates things in more ways than you could ever imagine. You know, it's like, you know, as an artist, you're complicated enough, right? And then you have to engage that complication of another artist on a regular basis, and then, you know, it's great and it's challenging all at the same time.
But I think we've worked together long enough where I can anticipate what you're thinking now, or at least I hope so. So then you think that the person's going to match the image the way that you're believing, but it doesn't happen, and that's surprising. But I think besides, all right, so we're both married, and I think besides being married, this is the closest relationship with a person I've ever had, which is interesting because I think then we start working almost telepathically. Like we have similar ideas, and if one of us has another idea for where to go with a project, the other one's probably has already been thinking about it too. So trying new things or knowing when a project is going to stop is never a problem for us. We usually know, all right, it's time to stop this and start exploring something else.
Yeah, so after 2.5 years of making that Antilocal work, it just came to a natural conclusion, and we felt like it was becoming redundant, or there wasn't any new territory for us to explore. So we decided we want to keep working together, but we need to figure out what that means. And so we were, you know, both kind of new to the areas we were living in and wanted to explore the landscape. So we're like, let's go outside. Let's get out of the house and do this. So we had this idea to make these landscape images, and so we would start with an image like this. And I made this one, or you made this one?
You made that one, but that was in response to what I sent you, right? So this is the first image. I made this image and I sent it to Mark, and then Mark responds with this image. And then we put them together in a similar way as we do our interiors. But Mark.
And so anyway, we made this image and it seemed, we liked it, but again, we didn't know what we were doing, so we made a whole bunch more images to try to figure this out. You know, we kind of worked through the issues, and we made some images that just didn't really...
Yeah, it didn't work. So we were working with our digital cameras for, trying to back up. For this project, and towards the end of Antilocal, we started with film, and then we moved into a digital realm. So to challenge ourselves more, we're like, let's use our 4x5 cameras, because this working collaboratively isn't hard enough. So Mark would make an image, and then I'd have to try to match it to scale. And it just showed how hard this was going to be in terms of trying to align things, processing time. There were too many logistical problems. Being in a tenure-track job and not having a lot of time to make work because you have teaching as well in service. And so using film maybe wasn't the best idea. So we got very discouraged with this project very fast.
Yeah, and so we make a bunch of excuses as to why we shouldn't do it.
Yeah. But it just wasn't the right time.
Yeah, and I don't know. We made a handful of these and had no idea what was going on, so we just let's set it aside. Let's move past that. So, what ultimately the good news I think for us was that it led us to our next body of work, which is the work in this room, and we call Conflation. And we thought, well, let's start back to how we first started collaborating and kind of work that way, and just set a few parameters and see what happens. And so I made this image on the right. Dominic made the image on the left. We butted them up against each other. Thought, hey, something's happening there. There's this connection between the spaces. We're I think very interested in stepping away from the literal and making photographically spaces that can't exist in the real world or don't exist. They could exist in the real world, but they don't. They only exist photographically, but approaching them in a way that connects the two of us, connects our homes. And so we made that, and still kind of figuring out, unsettled. We made this. It was the second image, and it's coming along. It's coming along. We're figuring it out. Be patient. Not you. We had to be patient. And then Dominic sent me this image, and it's a puzzle. It's a challenge. It's almost like you're going back into your first photography class, and it's like an assignment, and you're like, you got to figure it out, or you don't pass, right? Or you got to try to figure it out. And we really wanted to pass, so I responded with this image, and then we put them together.
Yeah, and that happened. So we were able to create these new spaces that didn't exist in reality. It touched on some of the things we were interested in individually with our thesis projects and Antilocal. And then it made us go back and, of course, re-edit and reshoot. So we started seeing that, all right, maybe this match that I had wasn't working. So I went back and reshot to try to make a more seamless, believable space. And then this one, about 2 years later, as I was shooting, I found what would become an appropriate match eventually. After we figured out how we were making this project.
Yeah, and so it became this idea where we wanted to make these false spaces that were relatively seamless, but also at the same time kind of pull the curtain back a little bit, right? So this isn't, we're not interested in fooling the viewer. We're not interested in heavily manipulating the image so it's this perfectly seamless structure, but making convincing images that can get you to engage and imagine this to be a real space, but then also allowing you the insight into the process, right? It would have been very easy for us to Photoshop two pictures together and be done with it, but that really wasn't at the heart of our interests at all. So again, like an image like this, sent to Dominic, which I thought I had an idea of what would come back. Like I had an image in my mind, okay, how he'll complete this other side. And I actually thought he would use the right-hand side as his basis. And then he sends me back this image, and it transforms my home into a space that looks nothing like I experience it on a daily basis. And it was extremely exciting. And part of that excitement came out of the fact that he sent me like the most boring image you could make, right? It's a door, and the door takes up the entire frame, and there's almost nothing there. But when it's with my image, it charges. Exactly. It's this real gratifying thing. No, it actually points out the brilliance of what he's sending me, because now my space, he's made it seem so believable, but at the same time impossible, right? There's no way that door can close into that frame. Like if you sit down and study that door, it doesn't fit, but it's convincing.
Well, I think that goes back to the nature of collaboration. It's putting your ego aside for the greater need of completing one image that's going to work. successfully by itself. So what we really have is just a really mediocre image of a door by itself that would be horrible to present on its own, but it does activate the space differently and gets us thinking about the authenticity of the space. I don't think either images, even Mark's image really tells us anything new or different about the space necessarily, but together they create something that's more of a paradox or a puzzle or something that maybe isn't necessarily believable the more you look at it.
And this image just maybe give you a little insight into behind the scenes look. You know, the image that you get sent is always present, right? You have to be constantly referring to it to get and it shapes the understanding of how you view your home, right? So it works on multiple levels. You know, it works on a very personal level in that it gets you to engage with your space in a way that you never would think, and with parts of it that you would think would be totally uninteresting or unfulfilling artistically. And then it comes together, and all of a sudden you get something that feels very satisfying, right? I never thought that the door frame leading to my hallway was very interesting, but when I see it as a new space, it takes on a new revelation.
Maybe we can take questions.
Yeah, maybe this would be a good time to take questions, especially since these images are in the gallery. Yes?
Did you do any color correcting? Was it just so happened that some of your walls were like the same color?
Oh, so did we manipulate?
Start making decisions like Dominic wants me to
So-
manage my
So did we manipulate the color in Photoshop to match the walls? No. For the most part, we have very similar wall colors. And I think that says something about the colors that our wives pick out for our houses, and then we have to paint them whatever they want. And then it works out for us. But
Our wives have very good taste in things, and it would look horrible if we chose so. Not to.
right. So I think listen to them. Yeah, but I think it says something about that lack of an identity again, because you know, my wife and I think, all right, we're unique. We're going to have this blue wall or this yellow wall, but then Mark and his wife have that too. And it's not really. There are a couple images that we might have to tweak colors. Maybe they're not quite exact, just to match them up a little bit. But for the most part,
and just for me, the main thing would be whenever we'd have images with hardwood floor. That you would automatically think that the color would match, but there's this strange range of tonality within oak hardwood floors that go from yellow to green to blue. And so for me, in terms of manipulation of color, correction of color, that seemed to be the key spot, which is really strange to me. I didn't expect it at all. I thought that would be the easy part to make sense.
I've walked around the Schoons for the last couple of weeks, and I've been really fascinated by the idea of the two photographers coming together and making a cohesive piece. But it wasn't until you talked about the door and not being able to close it, I really realized that there's something more to the images themselves. And so my question is, do you feel like these images can live without the story behind them being known by your audience in terms of there being two geographical locations and all of that, or how do you feel like it exists differently without needing them knowing?
I hope so. I know that, you know, having someone talk about it is helpful, but I think there's some instances where we've made images that were more direct that would hopefully key someone in a little bit. So an image like this, that if somebody spends some time with it, and maybe they can see that it's impossible for the space to exist, or especially something like this, or at least it's a very strange space, like this probably isn't real. You know, that there's two doors that go directly into each other and they kind of would bang into each other. So, you know, I think that's been an issue for us to a degree, that some of the work is too seamless, and that unless you can invest the time in it, I mean, they ask a lot of the viewer, I guess, some of them, you know, so to get somebody to do that. But I think we've made some that were more purposefully obvious or
So there's more variety in the portfolio to go back and forth between images that are more seamless and less seamless. But was your question specifically about the physical distance and location between us?
Yeah.
And is that important to the work for the viewer when he or she looks at it? It's a good question. I think I mean, we both live in the South now. Starkville, Mississippi is pretty similar to Carrollton, where Mark was living originally. And even though there's 4.5 hours or so in between us, things are strikingly similar, and I think that's fine. I think it wouldn't matter, I think, like Mark said earlier, that if we were living in the same apartment building and I was living right next door to him, it's more about the way the inhabitants are going to affect the space and the choices in the space, and then what does that say when you put those two different experiences together and then you see that they're very shockingly similar. So I don't know if, I think that's something that we even dropped from our artist statement after a while, was that the geographic differences maybe started to become less important the more we worked on them.
yes.
So you said that you're not interested in fooling the viewer, but that you want them to be convincing enough. And then what are the differences between those two?
Answer this carefully.
Yeah, no, it's
Coming from somebody's thesis.
I think the nuance is important. I think that is a valid question. I think when I say I want it to be convincing, it's that it allows you to be able to imagine it without much effort, so that you can see it in one respect that has a certain resonance with you, right? The way that photographs resonate within you, because we have this belief in the inherent truth within them, right? So I see this as a photographic print, and I say, there is an inherent truth in a photograph, so I want to believe it, right? So I think we like it to be convincing in that respect, but then we also want it to be so you can pick it apart if you're willing to. And all of that first half of what I just said, is counter to what photography actually is, as in terms of this truth vehicle of this, but we place that upon it, and so that's very interesting to us, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to add anything to that?
I'm not sure. I think maybe for me, when I'm thinking about how seamless they're going to go together, I want them to be a believable space at first, but I want the investor to investigate, the viewer to investigate the space more. So sometimes there are like subtle clues or subtle shifts that I want him or her to pick up on, maybe slight things in scale or perspective or things not aligning correctly. But I'm more interested in approaching it from an idea of memory and the idea of the memory of living in different spaces and how memory is distorted. And I can live in this home, and this home, and this home, but then when I experience things that are similar in all three houses, they start to merge together in my mind. Like I'm walking through these different places, but they become the same place. And I think that's one of the interesting things about our collaborative project, is that we have these different individual conceptual ideas with how we want to use photography in photographing domestic space. And then we can pull all of our interests together, and we could address those things as individual artists, but then as a collaborative pair. So I think sometimes we see the work in a similar way, but also slightly different from one another.
For sure, yeah, and that's another joy and difficulty of collaboration, is that, as I stand up here and talk about the work, sometimes I'm not sure if that's exactly how Dominic experiences and interprets the work, so.
How many pieces have you actually collaborated on? Or let me rephrase that. How many works are there that we haven't seen?
So in terms of projects, we had intended to collaborate prior to us actually collaborating and physically making something. We started out, we had an idea for an installation, but it required a rather large grant to be able to fund it. So we put this grant proposal together for a large, and it was related to photography and imagery that we were both interested in, but we never received funding for it, so it never became realized. And that was the first thing that we collaborated on, at least sitting down to write together. And then the two bodies in here, there was the failed landscape series. There was
some video work.
There's been some video work that hasn't got off the ground.
The double exposure.
Yeah, we have 3 or 4 outstanding projects. I mean, like not completed. I don't mean they're outstanding, but projects that haven't happened in one way or another.
All right, let me be a little bit more specific. The things from the gallery, these specific projects you guys are talking about, I'm imagining there's a lot more images that you guys produced that we're not seeing. Is that true, or is this the bulk?
Is this it? It's a good question.
There's 20 more in the storage.
I think there's a lot of failures out there, or pieces that, no, there's not more in the storage room. But I think there's a lot of failures out there, or pieces that are waiting to get matched that aren't there. But we do have, I don't know, I don't remember the exact number of images that we've made that we just don't feel comfortable with showing yet. But yeah, there's more.
Yeah, I have a folder on my computer that has a handful of images, from both projects that I haven't completed. Like I either didn't know how to, or I made an attempt and it was just awful, and so I didn't even show it to them. And then there's the ones where I made an attempt and it wasn't completely awful, and I showed it to them and it was a no-go. So I think our success rate is greater now than when we started. I think we had a lot of attempts that never went anywhere. Yeah. Yeah.
Folks, I'm going to jump in selfishly. Mark and Dominic need to, they're actually bring down the show tonight, and they're driving the show back to Atlanta tonight. So I always get nervous when I stand up and introduce the artists. Let me say a couple of things I forgot. These two are the tiniest artists you're ever going to meet. They spent 6 hours critiquing our students today, giving reason to have courage, which I really thank you for. It was great to hear when you guys talked about how you're concerned and you get nervous about putting work up. So seniors, take what they say to heart, and thank you for spending all that time. It's been awesome. They were great about setting up the work and helping me through this whole process. They are chill folks. So let me tell you, tension doesn't create. It isn't created from them. So thank you for coming on this way.
Thank you.